At 19, Mara Ellis had no home, no family to call, and only $187 left to her name. She had been sleeping in an old Subaru through one of the coldest winters in Montana, waking every few hours just to make sure the engine would still start before the temperature dropped low enough to become dangerous. Then, at a county auction, Mara did something everyone in the room thought was insane.
She spent $150 of her last $187 on an abandoned snow cabin high in the mountains. A place with broken windows, a leaking roof, and a road so buried in snow that nobody had wanted the property for years. The auctioneer laughed when her bid won. An old carpenter warned her that she hadn't bought a home, she'd bought a roof waiting to collapse. And when a local property owner offered her 10 times what she'd paid before she'd even spent a night there, Mara began to wonder if everyone knew something about the cabin that she didn't. But 3 nights later, while lying awake beside the old wood stove, Mara heard a slow knocking sound beneath the floor. Knock, knock. She pulled back the worn rug, pried loose a floorboard, and discovered a steel door hidden underneath the cabin. A door that appeared on none of the property records when she finally lifted it. Warm air rose from the darkness below. A narrow staircase disappeared underground, leading to a sealed room that hadn't been opened in decades. And when Mara reached the bottom and saw what someone had left inside, she realized the $150 cabin hadn't been abandoned for the reason everyone believed. But before we discover what was waiting for Mara beneath that floor, tell me in the comments, where are you listening to this story from? And what time is it there right now? I love seeing how far these stories travel and knowing whether you're starting your morning, relaxing in the afternoon, or listening late at night. Wherever you are, I hope you're having a peaceful day and that something good finds its way to you today. And if you enjoy stories about ordinary people, forgotten places, and secrets that can change a life, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one. Now, let's go back to the beginning. To the morning Mara Ellis had $187 left and nowhere warm to sleep. At 19, Mara Ellis owned almost nothing that could not fit inside her old Subaru. A duffel bag held 3 shirts, 2 pairs of jeans, socks, and the winter coat she had found at a thrift store in October. A plastic grocery sack held crackers, peanut butter, and 2 bottles of water. In her wallet were $187. That was everything. For 6 weeks, the Subaru had been her bedroom, kitchen, and shelter from the Montana winter. Mara had learned to sleep in layers and wake every few hours to run the engine for heat. That morning, the fuel gauge hovered above empty, and frost covered the inside of the windshield. She rubbed a circle clear with her sleeve and watched snow drift across the parking lot. A knock struck the passenger window. Mara jerked upright. The store manager stood outside, pointing toward the road. When she lowered the window, cold air rushed in. "You can't stay here overnight anymore," he said. He wasn't cruel about it, which somehow made it worse. "We've had complaints." "I'll leave, I'm sorry." Mara nodded before he could say anything else. She hated apologies almost as much as she hated pity. She drove into Bellwether with the heater off to save fuel. At a small diner, she bought coffee because it gave her the right to sit somewhere warm. She counted her money again beneath the table. $187. A room would swallow most of it. Gas and food could stretch it perhaps another week. On the bulletin board beside the register, a yellow county notice caught her eye. Tax property auction today. Most listings were parcels she couldn't afford. But at the bottom was a handwritten addition. Mountain cabin, as is, minimum bid subject to reduction, ... Mara tore off the address and walked 3 blocks to the county building, ... The auction was already underway. Farmers, contractors, and 2 men in heavy work jackets occupied folding chairs. Mara stood at the back, snow melting from her boots. Near the end, the auctioneer lifted a sheet. Last property, old cabin above Bellwether Ridge. Nobody moved. He described broken windows, roof damage, no maintained winter access, and years of unpaid taxes. The opening bid drew silence. He lowered it. Silence again. Finally, he sighed. County authorized minimum disposal price, $150. A man near the front laughed. Mara's fingers closed around her wallet. $150 would leave her 37. It was reckless, possibly stupid. But $37 and a roof sounded better than $187 and another night in the car. $150, she said. Heads turned. The auctioneer stared at her. You understand the property is sold as is? Yes. An older man with weathered hands looked back at her. Kid, have you seen that cabin? No. A few people chuckled. That place isn't a house, he said. It's a roof waiting to fall. Mara swallowed. Does the roof still exist? The room became quiet. The man studied her, then nodded reluctantly. Last I saw. Then I'm bidding. No one challenged her. The auctioneer waited, almost inviting someone to rescue her from herself. Sold. $150, less than an hour later. Mara stood outside holding paperwork and a key stained dark with age. The older man came down the steps behind her. Walter Hayes, he said. Mara Ellis. His eyes moved toward her Subaru, taking in the blankets visible through the rear window. He seemed to understand more than she wanted him to. Road up there won't be friendly today. I'll manage. Walter didn't argue. Hope you do. Mara drove until the paved road narrowed into packed snow. 2 miles from the cabin. The Subaru lost traction and slid sideways into a drift. She sat gripping the wheel, fighting tears. She had just spent nearly everything on a home she couldn't even reach. A tow truck appeared 20 minutes later. The driver, a young man named Eli Mercer, had been called for another vehicle farther down the road and stopped when he saw her. He pulled the Subaru free and, after hearing where she was headed, helped her get as close to the property as the road allowed. Mara carried her duffel the remaining distance through knee-deep snow. By the time the cabin emerged between the pines, her legs were shaking. It was small, crooked, and half buried in white. One window was cracked. The porch sagged. Snow weighted the roof. Mara unlocked the door. Inside smelled of dust, cold wood, and abandonment. There was one main room, a tiny kitchen, and an old wood stove. It was terrible. Mara smiled anyway. For the first time in months, she could close a door and know nobody could tell her to move her car. She cleared debris, found dry scraps of wood, and eventually coaxed a weak fire from the stove. Darkness settled over the mountain. Mara spread her blankets on the floor beside the warmth and placed the key next to her wallet containing $37. Home, she whispered, testing the word. Wind pushed against the walls. The old cabin creaked. Mara closed her eyes. Then came another sound. Knock. She opened them. Knock, knock. Mara sat upright. The sound wasn't coming from the door or the walls. She pressed one hand against the floorboards. Knock. This time she felt the faint vibration beneath her palm. Mara slowly lowered her ear to the wood. Whatever had made the sound was coming from an empty space beneath the cabin. Mara stayed on the floor for nearly a minute, her ear pressed against the cold boards. Nothing moved beneath her now. Only the wind scraped pine branches against the cabin. She told herself Walter had been right about old buildings. Wood expanded, pipes shifted. Except she had seen no plumbing worth shifting, and the vibration had come from directly beneath her hand. At daylight, she carried a broken broom handle outside and walked around the cabin. Snow reached almost to her knees. The structure rested low against the slope, with stones and packed earth visible beneath the walls. There was no basement entrance, no foundation window, nothing suggesting a room below. She crouched near the porch and pushed the broom handle into the snow until it struck frozen ground. "Nothing," she muttered. By mid-morning, an engine struggled up the road. Walter Hayes appeared carrying a toolbox and 2 pieces of plywood. "Figured that window would freeze you before the roof got the chance," he said. Mara almost refused the help. Then a gust blew through the cracked pane. "I can't pay you." "Didn't ask." Walter covered the damaged window while Mara held the plywood. Eventually she mentioned the knocking. "Under the floor," he asked, 3 times? Walter stepped inside and stamped his boot in several places. Old wood. Temperature drops, things contract. Could be pipes. What pipes? Walter glanced toward the tiny kitchen. The rusted sink had no running water. Fair point. He knocked on the floor with his hammer handle, but found nothing unusual. Mara asked how long the cabin had been empty. Walter thought for a moment. "Close to 20 years, maybe. Nobody stayed long after that." "Why?" "Hard place to live, harder place to maintain." It was an ordinary answer, but Mara noticed he looked toward the old stove before returning to the window. After Walter left, Mara spent the afternoon making the cabin less impossible. She swept mouse droppings from corners, stuffed cloth into gaps, and stacked the remaining dry wood beside the stove. Outside, while gathering fallen branches, she noticed something that stopped her. Snow covered almost everything around the cabin in a thick white blanket. Yet beside the chimney wall was an irregular patch where the snow had thinned to wet earth and ice. Mara touched it. The ground was cold, but not frozen as solid as the surrounding soil. She looked up at the chimney. The small fire inside could explain some warmth, but the patch extended farther from the wall than she expected. Back inside, she studied the stove. It stood on an old metal hearth near the center wall. A faded rug covered much of the floor around it. Mara dragged the rug aside. Dust rose into the light. Most floorboards were dark, scarred pine, but several beside the stove were noticeably lighter, newer, or at least replaced later. She knelt and ran her fingers along the seams. One board had small nail heads that didn't match the others. A vehicle approached outside before she could investigate further. Mara stepped onto the porch. A dark pickup stopped beyond the snowbank, and a broad-shouldered man in an expensive winter coat climbed out. Mara Ellis. "Who's asking?" Dean Harrow. He looked past her at the cabin. "Heard somebody finally bought this place. News travels fast. Bellwether isn't large." His smile was polite without being warm. "I'll give you $1,500 for it." Mara stared at him. "I bought it yesterday, and you'd make $1,350 overnight." The number hit hard. $1,500 meant food, gas, perhaps weeks in a motel, safety. Yet something about an immediate offer 10 times her purchase price made her hesitate. "Why do you want it?" "I own property nearby. Easier to add the parcel now than deal with it later." "Then why didn't you bid yesterday?" His smile faded slightly. "Didn't think anyone else would." Mara looked back at the cabin. Yesterday, everyone had laughed at $150. Today, someone wanted to pay $1,500. "No," Dean studied her. "Think about it. I did." He put his gloves back on. "You don't know what you bought. Apparently you think I bought something worth $1,500. for the first time. Dean looked irritated. Then he returned to his truck and drove away. Mara stood outside until the engine disappeared. His warning remained with her. That evening she returned to the lighter floorboards, using the claw of an old hammer Walter had left for her. She worked one nail loose, then another. The first board resisted until she pulled with both hands. It lifted with a dry crack. Mara expected dirt beneath it. Instead, her fingers touched metal. She removed enough boards to expose the edge of a rectangular steel plate concealed below the floor. Dust coated its surface. Near one end was a recessed iron ring, a handle. Mara's heartbeat quickened. She brushed away years of dirt until shallow scratches appeared in the steel. They weren't random. 3 characters had been deliberately carved into the plate. Mara wiped them clean with her sleeve and stared. S.E. 1978. Her eyes stayed on the first 2 letters. Alice, her own last name. Mara did not pull the iron ring. She sat beside the exposed steel plate until the fire burned low, staring at the carved initials as though they might rearrange themselves into an explanation. S.E. could belong to anyone. Alice was not an uncommon name. Still, seeing those letters beneath a cabin she had bought by accident made sleep impossible. By morning, she had decided that opening the door without knowing what lay beneath it was a bad idea. Instead, she drove into Bellwether and found the public library near the center of town. The building was warmer than the diner and almost empty. Behind a desk marked Local Archives sat a gray-haired woman wearing reading glasses on a chain. June Bell. She introduced herself after Mara explained why she had come. "You bought the Ridge cabin? For $150? June lowered her glasses. "So you're the girl everyone's talking about." Mara immediately regretted mentioning the price. "I need to know who owned it." June led her to a back table and brought out property records. The earliest document showed the cabin had been built in 1956. Mara traced the simple floor plan with one finger. Main room, small kitchen, no basement, no underground storage, nothing beneath the stove. "Could renovations be missing?" she asked. "Possible," June said, "but permits should exist if they were reported." They followed the ownership history forward. Names changed several times until the records reached the late 70s. Then the sequence stopped. The next clear documents began again in 1994. "What happened between 1977 and 1994? Mara asked. June frowned and checked another index. "That's what I'd like to know." She searched a second box, then a third. Nothing filled the gap. Mara showed her the initials she had copied onto a scrap of paper. S.E. 78. June stared at them. Could be a builder. Could be an Ellis. Could be... Mara hesitated. "My last name is Ellis." June looked at her more carefully, but did not turn it into something dramatic. "Then let's not guess. Let's look." She brought Mara to an old microfilm reader. They searched local newspapers around 1978 without finding the cabin. Mara was ready to give up when June suggested widening the dates. An article from January 1982 appeared beneath the glass. "Blizzard strands workers above Bellwether." The photograph was grainy, showing volunteers standing in deep snow beside a cabin Mara recognized immediately. Her cabin. "Wait," Mara leaned closer. June adjusted the focus. 7 people stood in the photograph. One man near the center wore a heavy work coat and held a shovel. Something about his face tightened Mara's chest. The eyes. She had seen those eyes in the few photographs she still had of her mother. June read the caption slowly. "Local volunteers following the January storm. Walter Hayes."
Mara looked sharply at her.
June continued through several names, then stopped. Samuel Ellis. Mara stared at the man. I don't know a Samuel Ellis. Father, grandfather, I never knew my father. My mother never talked about her family. Saying it aloud felt more exposed than she expected. Her mother, Claire, had died when Mara was young. After that came foster homes, caseworkers, temporary bedrooms, and years of learning not to ask questions that nobody could answer.
June printed the photograph. This proves only that Samuel Ellis was there, she said gently, not who he was to you. Mara appreciated that she did not pretend otherwise. She folded the copy and put it in her coat. When she returned to the cabin that afternoon, Walter's truck was waiting. Mara showed him the steel plate.
His expression changed when he saw it.
You knew there was something under here. No, you were in that photograph in 1982. Walter looked at the printed image she handed him. That's me. Mara pointed to Samuel. Who is he? Walter studied the picture for several seconds. Samuel Ellis. I know his name. Who was he? A man who spent a lot of winters on this mountain.
It was not enough. But Mara saw something in Walter's face that stopped her from pushing. She pointed toward the iron ring. Help me open it. Walter tested the steel, then fetched a pry bar from his truck. Rust held the plate tightly. They cleared more floorboards and worked opposite sides until the seal broke with a low, metallic groan. Mara pulled the ring. The plate rose several inches, and a current of dry air touched her face. Not freezing air, warm air. Walter noticed it too. Beneath the opening, narrow wooden steps descended into darkness. Mara found a flashlight. Stay behind me, Walter said. It's my cabin. Then you can fall through your own stairs after I check them. Despite herself, Mara almost smiled. Walter descended first, testing each step. Mara followed. The staircase ended in a room built from rough stone beneath the cabin. It was larger than she expected, but low-ceilinged. Against one wall stood several folded metal cots. Shelves held dusty jars and empty tins. A wooden table sat near an old furnace connected to pipes disappearing upward. Nothing looked recently disturbed. This is why the ground stayed warm, Mara whispered. Walter touched one pipe. Could be holding heat from your stove system. Mara moved her flashlight across the walls. Marks appeared in the beam. At first, she thought they were scratches. Then she realized they were names. Dozens of them, written in pencil, charcoal, and faded ink. Some had dates beside them. Others had small lines marking days. Mara counted slowly. 47 names. Walter stood silent behind her. What was this place? She asked. He did not answer. Mara moved closer to the wall, reading each name. Families. Men, women, children. The dates stretched across several winters. Near the bottom, the writing changed, smaller and less steady than the rest. Mara crouched. Her flashlight trembled slightly in her hand. The final entry contained a name she knew better than any other. Claire Ellis, age 11. Mara stopped breathing. Her fingers hovered over the faded letters without touching them. Claire, Walter said quietly behind her. Mara could barely force the words out. That was my mother. Mara remained crouched before her mother's name until the flashlight beam began to shake. Claire Ellis, age 11. The letters were faded, but they were unmistakable. She had spent years with only fragments of Claire's life, a few photographs, a hospital bracelet, a birthday card saved from childhood. Her mother had never mentioned Bellwether, never mentioned the cabin, and never mentioned Samuel Ellis. Yet Claire's name had been waiting beneath Mara's floor all this time. "Did you know her?" Mara asked. Walter stood near the stairs, his face half hidden in shadow. "I knew who she was. That isn't what I asked." He looked toward the wall. "She was Samuel's daughter." The answer landed harder than Mara expected. She stood too quickly and struck her shoulder against a beam. "Samuel was my grandfather." "Looks that way." "You knew him?" "Yes. And yesterday you didn't think that was worth mentioning?" Walter accepted the accusation without defending himself. "Yesterday I didn't know who you were." Mara wanted to be angry, but the room demanded too much attention. She turned away and swept the flashlight across the shelves. Whatever explanation Walter owed her could wait. She needed to understand what this place had been. There was no treasure, no stacks of cash, no jewelry, no hidden fortune that would make the last weeks of sleeping in her car disappear. Instead, she found ordinary things arranged with strange care. Folded wool blankets, rusted cans, empty medicine bottles, a child's red mitten stiff with age, a thermos with a cracked lid, several metal cups. The cots against the wall were narrow enough that sleeping on them could never have been comfortable. People stayed down here. Mara said. Walter nodded. "Looks like it. 47 people, maybe more." She lifted the mitten. "Why would anyone sleep underground?" Walter glanced toward the old furnace. "Because underground can stay warmer than upstairs when the temperature drops far enough." Mara remembered the warm patch outside and the dry air rising when they opened the steel door. An emergency shelter. Could have been. She almost snapped at his cautious tone, but a rusted metal box beneath the table caught her eye. It was small, with a broken clasp and orange corrosion along the corners. Mara dragged it into the light. "Cash box." Walter knelt beside her. "Careful. Lid might be sharp." Mara worked the clasp loose, using the tip of her screwdriver. The lid opened with a brittle squeal. Inside were no bills. Instead, bundles of paper filled the box. Grocery receipts, handwritten notes, pharmacy slips, fuel invoices, and a thick ledger bound in cracked brown cloth. Mara opened it carefully. Names filled the pages in neat handwriting. Some matched those on the wall. Each entry listed a date, number of people, supplies used, and occasionally a short note. She read aloud, "Miller family, February 6th. 2 adults, 3 children. Soup, blankets, lamp oil." On the far right was a space marked payment. Beside the entry, someone had written 2 words, "No charge." Mara turned the page. Thomas Reed, overnight, coffee, dry socks, no charge. Another page, Janet Bell and Son, 2 nights, medicine, no charge. She looked at Walter. "Samuel wrote this. That looks like his handwriting." Mara found the name Samuel Ellis written inside the front cover. There was no title, just an address for the cabin and a telephone number too old to matter. Page after page showed the same pattern. People arrived during winter storms. They used food, fuel, medicine, blankets. Most paid nothing. Some left a few dollars. Others promised to return with supplies. One entry contained a carefully folded note. Mara opened it. "Thank you for taking us in when the highway closed. I don't know what would have happened to the children without the fire." No signature remained, only a water stain. Mara swallowed. "So this wasn't a secret room?" Walter looked around. "Maybe it was secret to the county, not to the people who needed it." That thought shifted something inside her. She had imagined hidden rooms as places for hiding valuables or shame. This room had been built to hide people from the cold, The idea felt impossible and strangely intimate. Her grandfather, a man she had not known existed yesterday, had stood here measuring medicine, counting blankets, writing names. Her mother had been 11 somewhere among those winters. Mara turned more pages, searching for Claire. Before she found her, she heard tires outside. Walter heard them too. They climbed back into the cabin. Dean Harrow stood on the porch when Mara opened the door. His gaze dropped immediately to the missing floorboards and the raised steel hatch. His expression changed. "You opened it." Mara stiffened. "So you knew it was there?" Dean did not answer directly. "My offer still stands. 1,500, 5,000. Walter's eyebrows rose. Mara stared at Dean. "Yesterday this place wasn't worth bidding on. Yesterday I didn't know you'd start tearing it apart." "Why do you care?" "Because old properties come with old problems." Mara folded her arms. "Tell me about Samuel Ellis." Dean's face lost what little warmth it had. "Where did you hear that name? Answer me." He looked past her toward the open hatch. "Some things stayed buried for a reason. That's not an answer. It's the only one you're getting." Dean turned toward his truck. Mara followed him into the snow. $5,000 for something you didn't want yesterday? You know something? He stopped but did not turn around. "Sell the property." Mara, "No." Dean drove away without another word. Back inside, anger gave Mara enough energy to keep searching. She returned to the ledger, moving faster now. Receipts slipped from between pages. One invoice listed lumber. Another listed heating oil. Then she found a familiar surname written in Samuel's careful hand. Harrow. Mara froze. The entry was dated January 1982. She read the address twice, then carried the ledger upstairs and showed Walter. "Do you know this place?" Walter looked at the line and gave a slow nod. "Yes." "Whose address is it?" His silence answered before his words did. "That was Dean Harrow's father's house." Mara looked toward the road where Dean's truck had disappeared, then back at the ledger. Whatever Dean wanted buried, his own family was already written into Samuel Ellis's records. Mara waited until morning before driving down from the cabin. She had barely slept. The ledger page with the Harrow address sat folded inside her coat pocket. Though she knew the words by memory, January 1982, Harrow, several workers, supplies used, no charge. By the time she reached Bellwether, she had decided she was done accepting half answers. Dean Harrow's office occupied the front of a low building beside a lumber yard. His truck was parked outside. Mara stepped in without knocking. Dean looked up from a desk covered in invoices. "You again." She placed the copied ledger entry in front of him. "Your father's address." Dean's expression tightened. "Where did you get that Samuel's ledger? You should leave old records alone." "Why?" "Because your family is in them." Dean leaned back and stared at the paper for a long moment. "What do you think you found?" "I don't know. That's why I'm here." Mara crossed her arms. "You knew about the room. You knew Samuel. You offered $5,000 after I opened the hatch. So tell me why." Dean rubbed one hand across his jaw. For the first time, he looked less angry than tired. "My father owned a logging company. Small operation, winter crews, men who worked whether the weather was good or not. And in January of 1982, a storm came in faster than expected. Several trucks got stranded above the ridge. Roads disappeared under snow. Radio contact was bad." Mara glanced at the paper. "Samuel took them in." Dean nodded once. "Some of them. Maybe most. My father, too, for part of a night." Mara had expected something darker. A crime, a theft, a reason for Dean to hide the past. Instead,
The truth sounded painfully ordinary. Then why act like it was some terrible secret? Dean looked toward the lumberyard window. Because my father spent years talking like he built this town with his own hands. Never liked admitting he needed anybody, especially Samuel Ellis. Why Samuel didn't have much, didn't own a company, didn't have money. But when that storm hit, he had heat, supplies, and enough sense to keep people alive. Dean looked back at her. My father never forgot owing him. And you wanted the cabin because you're embarrassed. I wanted the land because it fits with property I already own. I knew the place had history. I didn't know the room was still intact. Mara studied him, trying to decide whether that was everything. You could have just said that. People don't always enjoy telling stories that make their families look smaller than they remember. It was the most honest thing Dean had said to her. Mara left without another argument. At the library, June was waiting behind the archive desk. Mara explained what Dean had told her. June listened, then disappeared into the back room and returned with several reels of microfilm. If the storm was that bad, someone wrote about it. They searched for nearly an hour. Mara's eyes burned from reading old columns until June suddenly stopped the reel. Here. A front-page article dated January 19, 1982, described the blizzard Dean had mentioned. Roads closed, power lines down, logging crews stranded. 17 people rescued or sheltered in scattered locations around Bellwether Ridge. A smaller paragraph near the bottom mentioned a local resident who had opened his mountain cabin to stranded workers and travelers. Samuel Ellis. No photograph this time. No long tribute. Just 3 lines. Mara read them twice. That's it. Newspapers don't always know which part matters. June said, they searched neighboring issues. Another brief note reported that all 17 people sheltered near the ridge survived. Samuel's name appeared once more, misspelled. Mara leaned back from the machine. He saved 17 people and got 4 lines. June looked at her. Maybe he wasn't doing it for the paper. That thought followed Mara all the way back to the cabin. Walter was already there, repairing a loose section of the porch railing. Mara showed him the article. You knew about this? Walter nodded. Everybody around here did, once. Why didn't anyone tell me? You arrived 3 days ago. Mara. The answer was fair enough to sting. She went inside and returned to the underground room. The ledger felt different now. She no longer saw rows of names. She saw people arriving cold, wet, frightened, carrying children or injuries or nothing at all. She opened the cash box again and sorted the papers more carefully. One letter thanked Samuel for giving a child antibiotics during a storm. Another came from a man who promised to repay him for food and fuel. Across the bottom, in Samuel's handwriting, were 4 words. Paid by surviving. Mara sat very still. There was no grand statement, no speech about generosity, just those words. She traced them lightly with her thumb. Paid by surviving, she whispered. Walter had come down the stairs behind her. He read over her shoulder and gave a small, almost sad smile. Sounds like him. Mara looked through more letters. Most were brief. Thank you for the blankets. Thank you for getting us off the road. Thank you for taking us in. None made Samuel sound important. They made him sound present, available. The kind of person who opened a door when someone was cold. That hurt in a way Mara had not expected. She had spent years believing family meant the people who left, disappeared, died, or forgot to come back. Yet here was a grandfather who had apparently spent years making sure strangers had somewhere to go. Why did my mother leave? Mara asked. Walter's face changed. I don't know everything about that. But you know something. I know Claire loved him, and I know loving someone doesn't always mean staying. Mara turned back to the box, frustrated by another incomplete answer. She began removing the last receipts from the bottom. Her fingers caught on an envelope wedged beneath the cardboard lining. Unlike the others, it had never been opened. The paper had yellowed, but the handwriting remained clear. Mara lifted it carefully. On the front, Samuel had written one line, "For Claire, when she's ready." Mara stopped moving. Her mother's name stared back at her. Walter said nothing. Mara turned the envelope over. The seal was still intact. Whatever Samuel Ellis had wanted Claire to know had remained inside for decades, unread. Mara carried the envelope upstairs and set it on the table beside the stove. For nearly an hour she did nothing with it. She heated water, added another piece of wood to the fire, and watched the paper from across the room as though it might open itself. For Claire, when she's ready. Her mother had never been ready. Or maybe she had never known the letter existed. Walter sat in the chair near the window, repairing a loose hinge he had taken from a cabinet. He did not mention the envelope until Mara finally picked it up. "Would you open it?" she asked. Walter kept his eyes on the hinge. "It wasn't written to me. She's gone." Still wasn't written to me. Mara turned the envelope over in her hands. "What if it's something I shouldn't know?" "Then you decide whether knowing matters more than wondering." She looked at him. "That's not helpful." "Wasn't supposed to be." He set the hinge down. "Mara, nobody here gets to tell you what belongs to you. Not me, not June, not Dean Harrow. If you open it. That's your decision. If you don't, that's yours too." Mara stared at the faded seal. Most of her life had been built out of other people's decisions. Caseworkers decided where she slept. Foster parents decided how long she stayed. Employers decided when they no longer needed her. Landlords decided what she could afford. Even death had decided when her mother disappeared from her life. She slid one finger beneath the edge of the envelope and broke the seal. The paper inside had been folded twice. Samuel's handwriting was the same careful script she had seen in the ledger. "Claire, if you're reading this, then I hope enough time has passed for you to hear what I could not say correctly when you were here." Mara stopped. Her throat tightened. She forced herself to continue. "Samuel wrote about the years after Claire's mother died. He admitted he had become obsessed with work around the cabin, with keeping supplies stocked, with helping people during storms. He described repairing the shelter, driving stranded families down the mountain, checking on workers, gathering medicine. None of it sounded heroic in the letter. It sounded like confession. I kept telling myself that helping people was how I was surviving losing your mother. I did not understand that while I was watching every road for strangers who might need me, I stopped watching my own daughter." Mara lowered the page. Walter remained silent. She read on. Samuel remembered Claire waiting for him at dinner while he was away delivering fuel. He remembered missing a school performance because the weather turned bad and someone had called from the ridge. He remembered telling her to be strong when what she needed was permission to be angry. "I thought providing a roof meant I was being a father. I did not see how alone you were under that roof." Mara blinked hard. Her mother's silence began to take a shape she had never imagined. Not hatred. Not abandonment without reason. Hurt. Samuel wrote that Claire had accused him of caring more about strangers than his own family. At the time, he had defended himself. Years later, he understood why she had said it. She had been grieving too, and he had mistaken her quietness for strength. He apologized without asking for forgiveness. Near the end, the handwriting became less steady. "The cabin is yours if you ever want it. Not because wood and land can fix what I broke. They cannot. But I want you to know there will always be a door here that opens for you. Mara pressed the heel of her hand against her mouth. She had spent years trying to remember Claire as perfectly as possible. The sound of her laugh, the smell of her shampoo, the way she used to tuck blankets around Mara's feet. But she had never known Claire had once been an 11-year-old girl standing in this cabin, waiting for her father to choose her. Mara had always imagined adults as people who understood why they were hurting. Now she saw two people who had loved each other and failed to say the right thing before time separated them.
"She left because of this," Mara said. Walter shook his head gently. "Not because of the room, because of him, because of grief, because of what happened after. People rarely leave for only one reason." Mara looked down at Samuel's final line. "If you never return, I hope you find somewhere that feels like home. If you do return, I hope I have learned how to listen." The letter ended there. No dramatic goodbye, no explanation for everything. Just an apology that had waited decades for someone who never read it. Mara cried before she realized she had started, quietly at first, then with the helplessness of someone who had spent too many years refusing to do it in front of anyone. Walter did not touch her. He simply stayed. That made it easier. When the tears finally slowed, Mara folded the letter along its old creases. "I used to think she didn't talk about her family because there was nothing worth talking about. Maybe talking hurt too much." Mara nodded. "Downstairs?" She placed the letter back inside its envelope, but did not return it to the cash box. She set it on the table beside the ledger. For the first time, Samuel Ellis felt neither like a mysterious stranger nor a forgotten hero. He felt human, generous enough to save people, blind enough to wound his own daughter, and honest enough to know the difference too late. Mara moved toward the old furnace, needing something practical to focus on. Dust coated the stonework behind it. She wiped the wall with a rag and noticed a shallow mark on one brick. A line, then another crossing it. Not writing, more like a crude symbol, almost a tiny map. Walter. He came closer. Mara traced the shape. The brick shifted slightly beneath her fingers. Together they worked it loose. Behind it was a narrow cavity in the wall. Mara reached inside and felt paper. She pulled out a small notebook wrapped in brittle cloth. The cover was stained but intact. She opened it carefully. Samuel's handwriting appeared on the first page. 4 words were written across the top. People we couldn't reach. Mara did not turn the page immediately. The words, people we couldn't reach, sat at the top in Samuel's handwriting, heavier than anything she had found in the ledger. Until now, the records beneath the cabin had been about survival. Names of people who made it through storms, families who slept on cots, children who received medicine, strangers who walked back into the cold, alive. This notebook felt different before she even opened it. Walter stood beside the furnace, his face drawn. "You ever seen this?" Mara asked. "No." She turned the page. The first entry contained a name, a date, and a short description of a storm. Samuel had written the last known location of a stranded truck and the time he had tried to reach it. Below that were 3 lines about the road conditions and one final sentence. "Found too late." Mara swallowed. She turned another page. Another name, another winter, a couple whose car had gone off the road before anyone knew they were missing. Samuel had written what supplies he carried, which trail he tried, where the snow became too deep. Mara realized slowly that the notebook was not a memorial in the usual sense. It was a record of failure. Each entry ended with something Samuel believed could have been done differently. More blankets needed at upper cabin. Keep second lantern by door. Store rope closer to road. Check logging route earlier when wind changes north. He was studying it, Mara said. Walter nodded. Trying not to make the same mistake twice, Mara kept reading. The notes became more detailed over the years. Samuel recorded temperatures, road closures, how long it took wood to catch when damp, how quickly medicine froze in an unheated box. He tracked which families lived alone and which crews worked late into winter. The hidden room below the cabin stopped looking like a mysterious construction and began to look like an answer to a question Samuel had asked himself over and over. What could I have done sooner? Mara turned to an entry dated several years before the 1982 blizzard. 3 workers had been caught beyond the ridge during a sudden whiteout. Samuel had tried to reach them with another volunteer. 1 survived. 2 did not. His writing on that page was cramped and uneven. Shelter upstairs loses too much heat in severe wind. Need protected space below grade. Need backup furnace. Need stored food where pipes won't freeze. Mara looked around the stone room. This is why he built it. Walter followed her gaze toward the cots and furnace. Seems so. Not because he wanted a secret, no. Mara rested the notebook on the table. Because people died. Walter's voice was quiet. And he couldn't accept that as the end of the story. The sentence stayed with her. Mara had always thought guilt looked like hiding. Samuel's guilt had built walls, stocked shelves, marked roads, and kept lists. But even that did not make it healthy. Page after page showed how deeply every loss had lodged inside him. He had written names years after the events, adding notes when better equipment became available or when a road changed. He had never stopped trying to rewrite outcomes that were already permanent. Mara understood that instinct too well. For years, she had replayed the last months of Claire's illness as though being a better child might somehow have changed them. She had wondered whether she had complained too much, needed too much, asked too many questions. Later, when foster placements failed, she assumed there had to be something she could have done differently. Be quieter, be easier, be less visible. He blamed himself, she said. Some of it, yes. Walter leaned against the wall. People do that when the truth is harder. What's the truth? Sometimes you do everything you can and somebody still gets lost. Mara closed the notebook. You sound like you've practiced saying that. Walter gave a humorless smile. Took me years. He was silent for a moment, then looked toward the old furnace. My wife was caught in a storm once. Before we were married, Samuel found her car after dark and brought her here. Mara looked at him sharply. She stayed in this room 1 night, maybe 2. She talked about it every winter afterward. That's why you've been helping me. Walter did not deny it. Partly. You don't owe me anything, I know. Then why? Walter met her eyes. Because Samuel helped someone I loved when he didn't owe her anything either. Mara looked away. She did not know what to do with kindness that came without a bill attached. That had been true when Eli pulled her car from the snow. It had been true when Walter brought plywood for the broken window. She had spent so long measuring every favor by what it might cost later that free help felt almost dangerous. But Samuel's ledger and notebook told a different story. Not everyone helped because they expected payment. Some people helped because someone had once opened a door for them. By afternoon, the temperature began dropping again. Wind pressed steadily against the cabin walls. Mara went upstairs to add wood to the stove and found her phone buzzing with a weather alert. Winter storm warning, heavy snow, high winds, travel may become impossible. Walter read the message over her shoulder. You should come down into town before dark. Mara looked around the cabin. The patched window, the sagging porch, the floorboards removed around the steel hatch. I just got here. That mountain doesn't care. I'm not leaving because of one storm. This isn't about proving anything. Mara hated that he was right. The old Mara would have stayed simply because someone told her to go. She began gathering essentials instead. Wallet, coat, Samuel's letter and notebook, both wrapped carefully inside her duffel. Then her phone rang. Eli's name appeared on the screen. "Hey," she answered. His voice came fast over static. "You still up at the cabin?" "For now. Listen, we've got a van missing on the upper road. 3 seasonal workers. Last contact was before the snow got bad." Mara looked at Walter. "Did they call rescue?" "Already happening. Roads are getting blocked." Eli paused. Their last known position was near Bellwether Ridge. Mara's grip tightened around the phone. How near static cracked between them. Then Eli answered. "About 3 miles from your cabin." Mara kept the phone pressed to her ear while wind rattled the cabin windows. 3 miles where she asked. "Upper Ridge Road," Eli said through bursts of static. "Rescue crews know the area, but one plow is stuck and another road is already blocked." Mara looked at Walter. He had heard enough from her side of the conversation to understand. "Do not go looking for them alone," he said immediately. Mara ignored the irritation that rose in her chest. "I wasn't planning to." She turned back to the phone. "Tell rescue services this cabin is open. If they find the workers nearby, they can bring them here." Eli was quiet for half a second. "You sure?" Mara looked toward the steel hatch in the floor. "There's a heated room underneath. Or there can be. If we get the furnace working." Walter was already reaching for his coat. "Then we work fast." Mara relayed the cabin location and everything she knew about the road. Eli promised to pass it directly to the search crews, then said he was heading toward the lower ridge with his tow truck to assist where he could. "Mara," he added before disconnecting, "stay at the cabin, unless rescue tells you otherwise." "I will." It was the first time she had said those words and actually meant them. She and Walter went downstairs. The old furnace had not run in years, but Walter had already inspected parts of it while they studied the room. Now he opened the access panel, checked the flue, and worked carefully through rusted fittings. Mara carried down dry wood, blankets, bottled water, and every usable supply she could find upstairs. "What do you need?" she asked. "Light." She held the flashlight while Walter cleaned the ignition area and cleared old debris. They did not pretend the furnace was safe simply because Samuel had once relied on it. Walter tested the draft first, then checked the venting twice. "Try it." Mara followed his instructions. The first attempt produced nothing. The second gave a cough of smoke that made them both step back. Walter adjusted the airflow. On the third attempt, a weak flame caught. Mara watched it trembling behind the metal grate. "That's it. That's the beginning." 20 minutes later, warmth began moving through the underground room. It was not strong, but it was steady. Mara unfolded 2 cots and arranged blankets over them. She found the old metal cups, washed 3 thoroughly, then filled a pot with water upstairs. Every action felt strangely familiar despite being new. Samuel had once stood in this room preparing for strangers he had not met yet. Mara understood now that the preparation itself had mattered. The storm worsened before dark. Snow struck the cabin sideways. Visibility beyond the porch shrank to almost nothing. Rescue services called twice. The missing van had been located abandoned near a drift, but the 3 workers were not inside. Footprints led away before disappearing under fresh snow. "They probably tried to walk out," Walter said. Mara's stomach tightened. In this, people make bad decisions when they're scared. She thought of herself spending $150 while nearly broke and almost laughed at the irony. Instead, she checked the fire again. An hour passed. Then someone pounded on the cabin door. Mara ran upstairs. Walter caught her arm before she opened it. "Check first,"
Through the fogged window, she saw two figures bent against the storm. Mara opened the door. A man and a woman stumbled inside, both coated in snow. The man could barely speak. "Van, stuck. Where's the third person?" Mara asked. The woman pointed back into the white darkness. "Daniel hurt his ankle. He told us to keep going." Walter swore softly. Mara grabbed the phone and called rescue services immediately. She gave them the workers' names and the direction they had come from. The dispatcher told her a team was approaching from the lower access road, but warned her not to attempt a search herself. Mara obeyed. The old version of her might have believed staying behind meant doing nothing. Now she understood that sometimes the useful choice was to keep the shelter ready. She led the two workers downstairs, where the temperature was already warmer than above. The woman began crying when she saw the cots. Mara wrapped her in a blanket and handed the man water. "You're safe here." The words sounded strange in her mouth. Safe here. In a cabin everyone had laughed at, in a room that had once been buried beneath her feet. Walter checked both workers for signs of severe cold exposure, while Mara heated soup upstairs. She carried bowls down carefully. Neither worker could pay her, neither asked the price. That mattered more than she expected. Nearly 40 minutes later, headlights flickered through the storm outside. Eli arrived first with two members of the rescue team in a four-wheel drive vehicle. Another truck followed behind them. They found him. Eli said as soon as Mara opened the door, two rescuers carried the third worker inside. Daniel was conscious but pale. One boot wrapped crudely around an injured ankle. The team had located him, sheltering beside a rock cut less than a mile away. Mara stepped aside and let the professionals work. She brought blankets when asked, hot water when asked, and nothing when nothing was needed. For once, she did not need to be the person who solved everything. Walter helped stabilize the injured ankle. Eli carried supplies. The rescue workers checked temperatures, breathing, circulation, and signs of frostbite. Mara kept the furnace running. All three workers survived the night. By morning, the storm weakened enough for emergency vehicles to begin moving them down the mountain. Before leaving, the woman who had reached the cabin first squeezed Mara's hand. "I thought nobody lived up here." Mara looked around at the blankets, the furnace, and the names on the wall. "Someone does now." Word traveled through Bellwether faster than Mara expected. By afternoon, June called to say people were already asking about the cabin. Families recognized surnames from the old ledger. Some remembered stories their parents or grandparents had told about Samuel Ellis and the shelter on the ridge. 2 days later, after the roads reopened, an elderly woman arrived with June. She introduced herself as Evelyn Carter and said she had once slept in the underground room during the winter of 1982. In her hands was a faded photograph. "I thought you should have this," she told Mara. Mara took it carefully. Samuel stood outside the cabin in summer sunlight. Beside him was a young Claire. Mara recognized her mother instantly. But there was someone else in the photograph, too. Claire was older than 11 now. Holding a bundled infant against her chest, Mara stared at the baby's face, then at Evelyn. "Who is that?" Evelyn's expression softened. "You..." Mara looked down again. Samuel, Claire, herself, 3 generations standing in front of the cabin. Her fingers tightened around the edges of the photograph. She had believed she had never been to Bellwether before. The picture proved she had been wrong. Mara stared at the photograph until the 3 figures seemed more real than the cabin around her. Samuel stood near the porch railing, older than in the newspaper photograph, but unmistakable. Claire stood beside him with one arm around a bundled infant. "Mara." "When was this taken?" she asked. Evelyn Carter pulled a chair closer to the stove. 19 years ago, late summer. Mara looked at her.
My mother came back here once. Evelyn nodded toward the photograph. She arrived with you. Samuel had already passed by then, but some of us still checked on the property. Claire hadn't been back in years. Mara looked again at Samuel's image and realized the photograph could not have been taken during that visit. Then this was from different times? It was a double exposure print made from two family negatives. Evelyn explained gently. Claire had it made while she was here. One old picture of Samuel at the cabin, one of Claire holding you in the same place. She wanted the three of you together. Mara's chest tightened. Why, I think she wanted to believe she could come home. Evelyn remembered Claire arriving exhausted, carrying baby supplies and almost nothing else. She had cleaned part of the cabin and talked about staying, but that night, memories overwhelmed her. She cried for hours. Evelyn said the next morning she packed the car. Did anyone try to stop her? I asked her to stay for breakfast. Evelyn smiled sadly. She said if she stayed another hour, she might never leave. Mara lowered her eyes. She never told me. Maybe she planned to someday. Mara had heard versions of that sentence her entire life. Maybe someday. Maybe when you're older. Maybe when it hurts less. Then time ran out. Evelyn touched the edge of the photograph. Your mother loved Samuel. That's what made leaving so difficult. After Evelyn left, Mara drove into town with June. They spent the afternoon examining the remaining county records, searching for the missing years in the property's history. June eventually located archived tax notices and probate references stored under Samuel's estate rather than the cabin's address. The explanation was disappointingly simple. After Samuel died, ownership had become tangled. Claire had left Bellwether years earlier. Notices went unanswered. Taxes accumulated. The county eventually took possession through ordinary proceedings. Later administrative transfers buried the older ownership history beneath parcel changes. So nobody stole it from her? Mara asked. Nothing here suggests that, June said. And nobody knew about me? Not according to these records. Mara sat back. Part of her had almost wanted someone to blame. A person could be confronted. An injustice could be corrected. Instead, her family had simply drifted apart until paperwork finished what grief had started. I didn't inherit it, Mara said. June shook her head. No. Mara gave a quiet laugh. I bought my own family's cabin for $150. Without knowing it was your family's cabin, that's the ridiculous part. Yet on the drive back up the mountain, ridiculous was not the word that stayed with her. She thought about the auction room, her $187, Walter warning her about the roof, $37 remaining in her wallet. She had believed she was making a desperate choice because any roof was better than a car. Somehow that choice had returned her to the one place her mother had once tried to return to herself. There was no plan behind it, no hidden hand arranging events, just coincidence, loss, and a cabin nobody else wanted. That made it feel more real, not less. Walter was repairing another section of port when Mara arrived. She handed him the photograph. I was here before. He studied it. Seems you were... I don't remember any of it. You were a baby. Mara leaned against the railing. I kept thinking finding out where I came from would make everything clearer. Did it? Some things. She looked toward the pines. Not everything. Walter handed the photograph back. That's usually how answers work. The following afternoon, Dean Harrow returned. This time he did not arrive with warnings. He carried a folder. Mara let him inside but remained standing. If this is another offer, it is. He placed the folder on the table. 40,000. Mara thought she had misheard. For this? For the cabin and parcel? You offered 1,500 4 days ago. Things changed. News of the rescue had spread. The property's history was attracting attention. Dean explained that the land connected well with his nearby holdings, and that he preferred buying now rather than watching the cabin become complicated later. Mara opened the folder. The number was printed clearly: $40,000. Her stomach tightened. $40,000 was not imaginary wealth. It was enough to replace the Subaru. Enough for rent somewhere warm. Enough to stop counting every grocery item before reaching the register. Enough to leave Bellwether without being homeless again. Dean watched her. You paid $150. Nobody would blame you. That was the problem. Selling made sense. Mara looked around the cabin. The patched window, the stove, the damaged roof Walter still worried about. Every part of the place required money she did not have. How long do I have take tonight? Dean left the papers after dark. Mara carried the offer downstairs. The furnace was cold again, but the room still held the faint smell of smoke from the storm. She sat on one of the cots and opened the contract. $40,000. Then she looked at the wall. 47 names. Claire Ellis, age 11. She remembered Samuel's ledger, no charge, paid by surviving. She remembered the frightened woman from the storm asking for nothing except warmth. She remembered Evelyn explaining that Claire had once tried to come home. Mara had spent her life leaving places before they could reject her. $40,000 offered her the safest exit she had ever been given. She closed the folder. Upstairs. Walter waited without asking what she had decided. Mara placed Dean's contract on the table and rested her hand on it. For the first time, leaving was the easy choice. Mara looked toward the open hatch, toward the names beneath the floor, and knew exactly what she was going to tell Dean in the morning. Dean Harrow returned shortly after 9 the next morning. Mara was waiting on the porch with his folder tucked beneath her arm. She had slept badly, but not because she was uncertain. For once, she had spent the night thinking about how to stay instead of how to leave. Dean climbed from his truck and glanced at the contract. You sign it? Mara held it out. No. He took the folder, but did not open it. $40,000 is a lot of money for this place. I know. You could buy something that doesn't need half its roof replaced. I know that too. Dean studied her for a moment. Then why keep it? Mara looked through the open cabin door toward the steel hatch. Because everyone keeps talking about what this property is worth. Samuel didn't use it that way. Dean followed her gaze. Samuel also spent most of his life without much money. Maybe. But people survived because he stayed. Dean had no argument for that. He tucked the folder under his arm. Offer's gone once I leave. Mara felt the old fear rise on, the instinct to grab security before it disappeared. $40,000 could make her immediate life easier, but easy and right had finally become different things. Then let it go. Dean nodded once and walked back to his truck. Keeping the cabin did not solve Mara's problems. By afternoon, she still had $37, a damaged roof, unreliable plumbing, an aging Subaru, and property taxes that would eventually arrive with her name on them. She needed food, fuel, and work. Sentiment could not patch shingles. Walter seemed almost pleased when Mara admitted this. Good, he said. Good means you're finally looking at the whole problem instead of one dramatic piece of it. He helped her make a repair list. Roof first, window seals, furnace inspection, porch supports, water system. Mara stared at the numbers Walter estimated and groaned. Maybe I should have taken $40,000. Too late. She looked at him sharply. Walter smiled. It was the first time she had seen him enjoy teasing her. Help began arriving in small pieces. June contacted families whose names appeared in Samuel's ledger. Not to ask for money, but to preserve their stories. Several volunteered anyway. One family brought insulation. Another delivered canned food and blankets for the underground room. A retired electrician inspected the cabin wiring. Nobody transformed Mara's life overnight. They simply made one impossible repair after another slightly less impossible. Dean surprised her most. A week after she rejected his offer, a truck from his lumber yard arrived carrying roofing boards and several bundles of shingles. Mara drove into town to confront him. "I can't pay for these. They're surplus." Why Dean kept signing invoices. "My father spent years pretending he owed Samuel nothing. I don't need to continue the tradition. Does this make us friends?" Dean looked up. "Absolutely not." Mara smiled. "Good." Walter supervised the roof repairs, but made Mara do enough of the work to understand them. June began cataloging Samuel's letters and records, preserving the originals while making copies for the cabin. Eli replaced a failing belt on Mara's Subaru and refused payment beyond the cost of the part. When Mara protested, he pointed toward the car. "You can repay me by not sleeping in it anymore." She found steady work in Bellwether, enough to cover food, fuel, and begin setting aside money for taxes. It was not glamorous. That mattered. Mara did not need another miracle. She needed a life she could maintain. By spring, the cabin no longer looked abandoned. The porch stood level. The broken window had been replaced. The roof no longer leaked. Downstairs, Mara and Walter preserved one section of the hidden room almost exactly as they had found it. The old cots, Samuel's shelves, photographs, copies of letters, and the 47 names on the stone wall. The other half became functional again. Clean blankets, bottled water, first aid supplies, flashlights, food that could be stored safely. The furnace was professionally inspected and repaired, near Samuel's old ledger. Mara placed a new book. On the first page she wrote, "No charge, months passed, then winter returned to Bellwether Ridge." The first major storm arrived after sunset, covering the road faster than the plows could clear it. Mara was feeding wood into the stove when headlights appeared through the snow. Walter had called ahead. A young woman had slid off the lower road and been brought up by a volunteer driver because the route into town was temporarily closed. She stepped into the cabin carrying a wet backpack, frightened and embarrassed. She could not have been much older than Mara. "I'm sorry," the woman said. "They told me I could stay here until morning." "You can." Mara took her coat and showed her downstairs. The woman stared at the stone room and the names on the wall. "How much is it?" "Nothing. I don't have much money." Mara looked toward Samuel's old ledger. The note she had found months earlier was displayed beside it in his handwriting. "Paid by surviving." For a moment, Mara saw herself at 19 with $187 sitting in a freezing Subaru. Calculating how many nights remained before money or weather defeated her, she remembered how hard it had been to accept anything without expecting a price afterward. "You don't have to pay me," Mara said. The young woman hesitated. "Are you sure?" Mara opened the door to the warmer section of the shelter. "I'm sure." Later, after her guest had fallen asleep, Mara remained downstairs, alone. Snow pressed silently against the mountain above them. She took out the photograph Evelyn had given her and placed it beside Samuel's picture, and the copy of his letter to Claire. For months, Mara had tried to decide what she felt about them. Samuel had saved strangers while failing to see how badly his own daughter needed him. Claire had loved her father, but had been unable to remain in the place that reminded her of everything she had lost. Neither was a hero without flaws. Neither was a villain. They were people who loved each other and carried pain badly. Mara could finally let that be enough. "I understand, Mom," she whispered. "Not everything." Maybe she never would, but enough. She opened the new ledger. Several names had already been entered from travelers and workers who had used the shelter during early storms. Mara turned back to the first page. She realized she had never written her own name. She picked up Samuel's old pencil, sharpened now but still usable, and carefully wrote, Mara Ellis, age 19. She paused. Samuel's old records used simple descriptions, sheltered, overnight, stranded. Mara considered each one. None felt right. She had arrived here homeless, nearly broke, believing the cabin was merely a roof nobody else wanted. She had discovered a room beneath it, then a grandfather, then a mother she had never fully understood, then a community connected by ordinary acts of kindness. But the greatest discovery was simpler. For most of her life, Mara had learned to leave before someone else could decide she no longer belonged. This time, she had been offered $40,000 to leave. She had stayed. Beside her name, Mara wrote one word, stayed. She closed the ledger and climbed upstairs. Wind moved through the pines and snow covered the road until the mountain beyond the windows disappeared completely. Inside, the stove burned steadily. Beneath the floor, someone who had nowhere else to go slept safely in the room Samuel Ellis had built after learning what happened when people could not reach warmth in time. Mara turned on the porch light and left it burning against the storm. The hidden room was no longer a place where the past had been buried. It had become what Samuel had always meant it to be, a place where nobody had to face the cold alone.